Tu podcast w głowie się mieści. Okay, so hello everyone. Today I have two great guests. One is Professor Paul Gilbert. He's a founder of Compassion Focused Therapy. He is a professor of clinical psychology in the University of Derby and visiting professor at the University of Queensland. And he have over 300 publications, including 22 books about scientific understanding and application of compassion. And my second guest is Dr. Julią Wahl, and she is a doctor of psychology. She is a researcher, and she's an academic teacher. And she also do a lot of trainings of compassion-focused therapy. He's a leader of compassion-focused therapy in Poland and mindfulness, in general. So, welcome on the Wrap Your Head Around It podcast, and today we'll talk about compassion-focused therapy, about the cognitive behavioral therapy too, like how we can differentiate CFT from CBT and how to effectively use it in general in the psychotherapy. So welcome on my podcast.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. And from the beginning, maybe I introduce you. Maybe you want to say introduce yourself in your way, or say something that I didn't say, or is it okay what I said on the beginning?
Fine. What you said is fine.
Satisfying. Okay. So maybe the first question, because we try to do this podcast together with you, Julia. So maybe you would first ask your question to Paul that we were discussed yesterday.
So Paul, I actually have two questions because people often ask me these. So the first question would be, what are the main misconceptions when it comes to CFT, compassion focused therapy? And another question concerns again, some of the misconceptions probably, what CFT and what it isn't, and where it belongs, because I understand CFT is not just another version or an extension of CBT. It's not an improvement on CBT. So CBT's previous so-called ways or concepts. And I see CFT as coming back to something more fundamental, I would say, in a way, something wider, as it tackles various disciplines, and it's not only to do with various psychotherapeutic modalities, but it also tackles such disciplines as neuroscience, anthropology. So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that CFT could not be limited to CBT, because then it would be going against the philosophy of CFT, this consilience, as you I think call it. So, what is the difference between CBT and CFT, and why this distinction may be important? So, the misconceptions and the differences between CBT and CFT. And apologies for maybe a long question like that.
Okay. So maybe a little bit of history will help here, because I did my PhD in Edinburgh in the 1970s on a medical research council unit, which was investigating depression and primarily looking at drugs. So a lot of the people that I was socializing with were all into what's happening in the brain. But psychology was developing interest in how psychological and social processes can change the brain. And actually, psychological and social processes can create brain changes that look very similar to the changes we get in depression. And so my first book was called From Psychology to Brain State, because basically that's what I've always been, as a brain state theorist. That's what I am. And that's really understanding the multiple processes that are operating to create states of your brain, states of your mind at any point in time. So then in 1989, I wrote a book called Human Nature and Suffering. I'd done some training with Tim Beck, who was terrific. And he was also very interested in evolutionary psychology. But my concern was to bring in motivational processes. So Human Nature and Suffering is really all about the evolution of different motivational systems and how they are organized in the brain and how people tap into them. And the two big ones we've been interested in for a long time is competitive behavior. Now, when people get caught up in competitive behavior, they can, on the one hand, become arrogant and narcissistic and so forth. They assume superiority. But many people who suffer from anxieties and depressions, they tend to be seeing themselves as relatively low rank and inferior. They're vulnerable to shame. They criticize themselves and so on and so on. And we now know what happens in the brain when people do that. So I'm basically a brain state theorist. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in compassion is because the physiology of compassion, what happens in your brain when you engage with compassion, is quite profound and has a major impact on how we process threat, for example, which we can look at in a moment. Now, when it comes to therapy, it's very important that we always distinguish a model of therapy from the techniques of a therapy. Now, Tim Beck was not that interested in developing complex models of therapy. He said we didn't need that. What we needed is ways to help people, and in particular, help them help themselves. And in a way, Beck was very keen on development of self-help programs, and he was probably one of the first leaders, along with Albert Ellis and a few others, to focus on helping people develop skills that they could begin to understand themselves. They could begin to see the link between the ways in which they think and the ways in which they feel and the ways in which they behave. And so, whereas person-centered therapy had really been focusing on creating a relationship where people can find their own solutions, psychodynamic therapy had been focused on helping people recognize processes that they might not have been aware of, but unconscious. Beck was very interested in helping people work with consciously available thoughts. And so the techniques that have come out of cognitive therapy are profoundly important, and there's a lot of evidence for them. There have been debates about whether you need to focus on cognition or whether behavior change is really the driver. So, for example, in anxiety conditions, exposure is pretty fundamental. Agoraphobia, you have to go out. Obsessional compulsive disorders, you have to really do things. So there's no doubt at all that cognitive behavioral techniques are profoundly important, profoundly powerful. But what we would argue is that if they're not done within a compassion context and you're not generating the physiological state of compassion, they're going to be less effective. And that's basically how we started with it, because as you know the story, we were working with depressed people and their negative thinking. And depressed people have negative views about the future, the self, and the world. And so they would see themselves as failures and useless and unwanted. And I had a lady who had been in and out of hospital and many overdoses and things. And she certainly felt that she was unlovable and hadn't been wanted. Parents, she'd been adopted and things like that. But she was able to stand back and recognize that she could come up with alternative thoughts, that she'd made a good relationship with her husband and she had good quality relationships with her children and so on and so on. But she said, yes, I know I can stand back and I know in reality I have got good relationships and I am lovable, but I don't feel it, you see. So I said to her, well, okay, so how do you hear that in your mind then? I mean, how do you actually hear those alternative thoughts? Speak them out as you actually hear them. And she was a little bit embarrassed, but she said, okay, so you're doing cognitive therapy? Pay attention to the evidence. You got a husband who loves you, haven't you? You got 3 lovely children.
Yeah, it all makes sense. Yeah.
So it all makes sense, but the emotional textures were very hostile. Now, nobody had told me to look at the emotion texture of the reappraisal process. I never really thought about it. So I began to ask other clients, how do you hear your alternative thoughts in your mind? And they all were pretty either cold, calculating, or pretty hostile. Come on, look at the evidence, that sort of thing. And we sort of played into that a little bit in the early days, because we'd get people to rate how much they believe this or how much they believe that and so on. So the obvious thing to do was to invite her to generate a compassion intention and a compassion voice, so that when she thought about the fact that she has a husband who loves her, that she would hear that in her mind in a very compassionate way. And she said, no, I'm not doing that. She said, that's ridiculous. That isn't going to help me. That's weak. That's being soft. So she wouldn't do it. And so that was the second shock. The first shock was how hostile people efforts were to be helpful. They had the good cognitive content, but not the emotional content. And then the resistance to trying to be compassionate and helpful. And the third thing was that when these clients did start to get into compassion, it opened up a lot of unprocessed rage and unprocessed grieving for, the parenting that they had wanted. They'd always wanted to be loved. So it opened up a lot of yearning. And that often sometimes even produced dissociative states. So compassion became incredibly difficult for some of these clients, particularly those who had come from abusive backgrounds. So that's how we really began. I'm a brain state theorist, always been interested in motivational processes, done a lot of research on that. Cognitive behavioral therapies are fantastic techniques, but you've got to get the motivational system. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you haven't created the brain textures that people need in order to be able to use the CBT.
Mm-hmm. So again, why is CFT not a part of the so-called third wave CBT? Because there is an ongoing.
Well, even Steve Hayes has given up that title now. Okay. He calls it process therapy. They moved on to that. I mean, CFT has always been a process therapy. Mm-hmm. That's what we're about. Mm-hmm. You know this because you know it extremely well. Mm-hmm. All the work we've done on shame and self-criticism, the different types of self-criticism, and so on. These are all process research, right? You can't really move into a therapy until you understand process. So we've always been a process therapy. Third wave cognitive therapy was really a way of sort of trying to identify another group. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with all these different schools and these different groups. We're not terribly keen on that. What we say is, let's just go back to the basic science. Mm-hmm. How does your brain work? How did it evolve? What helps it to function well? What makes it function not so well? Mm-hmm. So we're interested in that. And CBT is a very powerful set of techniques that have got a lot of evidence behind them. But we think that it is very important to also help people process basic motivation, to focus on the motivation to be compassionate. And we can talk about what that involves a bit later. But and we use a lot of first and second wave CBT as well, whereas I know Steve's not so keen on that stuff. He's more into acceptance and so forth. So, there's some wonderful things in ACT, but we don't need to parcel it off as a separate process or a separate school of therapy. We need the science-based therapy. That's it.
That's more important, the actual application, rather than all those various taxonomies.
Yes, that's right. We need to understand the science, right? And then we develop. So, for example, that heart rate variability is a very important predictor of mental health problems, and that if people don't change heart rate variability in therapy, they tend not to change, or if they do change, it doesn't last. So, people like Patrick Steffen in the States has shown that. And therefore, because we're a biopsychosocial approach, we must have therapies that have a physiological impact. And as you know, there's a lot of research now showing how compassion motivations change the brain because of neuroplasticity. So we must have therapies that have some physiological impact. We can't ignore the body.
Yeah. And,
So
you wanted something?
on that note, so what is your not only personal but obviously professional stance on the polyvagal theory? Because again, that's there's an ongoing discussion, whether there's it's valid or not, and useful. Is the polyvagal theory how a big part of your thinking, or Paul?
Yeah, well, we were very interested. If you read Human Nature and Suffering, which came out in '89, we touch on the issue of the parasympathetic system and so on, so on. But what Steve's done is he's taken that on big time, and he's tracked it back to the evolution of the vagus nerve and how the vagus nerve evolved within the attachment system to facilitate mum and baby coming together. Because for many species that don't have an attachment system, the immediate response is for separation. So turtles, for example, lay their eggs and then they disappear, and the babies break out of the nest. Then they have to fend for themselves. They have to disperse. So dispersal is the common reproductive behavior until attachment. So what has to happen then for attachment is for the closeness between them not to stimulate threat, so they don't attack each other or run away from each other, but actually stimulate a sense of security and safeness and so on. So Steve's done a lot of work on how the evolution of the vagus nerve regulates the sympathetic nervous system and regulates the threat system through the use of voice tones and stroking and so forth. There's, of course, people argue about whether the vagus does all the things that Steve says it does or not. But I don't think anybody disagrees with the fact that the vagus nerve was very important in attachment and is very important for emotion regulation. I think that's agreed. We have a few differences with Steve. For example, Steve talks a lot about the issue of playing dead, that sort of freeze response, whereas we see a lot of depression as to do with learned helplessness, which is our chronically reduced states of explorative behavior, where Steve doesn't talk so much about these chronic states of reduced explorative behavior that you get out of helplessness. We also take the attachment theory of protest despair, where some children who get abused or neglected, they show despair states very quickly.
Okay, so Adam, if you don't mind me asking another question, and
sure.
And it might not be chronologically, so if you don't mind us going back to CFT later, but I would like to more generally ask you, Paul, about not only CFT but therapy in general. So, how do you see the future of CFT? Its, let's say, next stages of development, and maybe further applications, and what needs to be changed in terms of our thinking about therapy. So, how do you see the future, not only of CFT and therapy? And not so long ago, I read, Harry's book. He's neither a psychologist nor a psychotherapist. And whilst I may not agree with everything that he says, I do agree with the main premise of his book, that we are disconnected as human beings on various levels. And even therapy in its present individualized form may add to that disconnection. So we create what, and I like to quote my one of my favorite philosophers, Laurent Berland, cruel optimism. So the tool that's supposed to get us somewhere, help us reach our goal, becomes the main goal in itself, and therefore the obstacle to the actual goal that was important to us in the first place. So the future of therapy, because you do write about it extensively.
Yes, so this very important point that you make, I think there's a little bit of confusion with some of that thinking. For example, it's like saying, well, smoking causes cancer, so we need to stop people smoking, but then we're not going to treat them for cancer. Well, that's not right, is it, really? I mean, the point is, of course, we have to change society. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But what do we do in the meantime with those individuals who are depressed? You can't just leave them on the side street. So you do both things, right? You have to do both things. Now, the key thing here to note, and I use a lot of Steve Borges's work. I think he does some great stuff. Is that we moved out of dominant hierarchical relating, primarily organized through dominant aggressive males. That's how a lot of hierarchies are organized in primates. And about 2 million years ago, subordinates started to gang up against the dominants and basically kick them out. So individuals couldn't dominate a group. And that gradually evolved into egalitarian social living, which we call hunter-gatherer societies. And as part of that, we developed an incredibly social brain. And we developed ways in which our social relationships became absolutely fundamental to the regulation of a lot of physiological and psychological processes. So we are a highly social species. We're highly regulated through the quality of our relationships. And hunter-gatherer societies show a number of key qualities. One is they play a lot. They have a lot of joy, and so forth. They do that. And also they share a lot. They care and share. They're a care and share way of living, and people don't really own very much. They don't store wealth. They don't accumulate wealth. So that's our natural way of living, really, is to care and share in relatively small groups. Once you get the group to become bigger, things become more tricky. Now, what happened, as you know, is with agriculture, then all of a sudden wealth started to increase. Rather than hunt, we actually rounded up animals and bred them and kept them in cages, pens and things like that. And so wealth increased, and then that reintroduced this hierarchical fighting. And unfortunately, because we had a highly social, intelligent brain, it really activated a terrible dark side of humanity. And you look at the last 5,000 years, and it's been atrocious, really, particularly with dominant aggressive males getting into power and then causing all kinds of mischief, wars. And, humans are potentially a very nasty species indeed, the way we tortured people, enslaved them, the treatment of women. I mean, you can go on and on, can't you, really? So that's a very serious problem. We haven't just lost connection. The last 5,000 years, we really haven't had it. We've actually had something much, much worse. We've grown up in these awful hierarchical societies where some people have done very well, but most of the people have not. The lives of those that are at the bottom ends of the rank have been pretty miserable and awful, actually. So, yes, I agree in the disconnection stuff, but it's a little bit romanticized. We have a serious problem in how we deal with power hierarchies and how we stop these aggressive males getting into power. I mean, they're all over the place. And they really are mischief makers because they stir up people's dark side and their selfishness and their grasping, and they reduce any concern with caring and sharing. I mean, certainly if you look at the UK under this right-wing government, they've destroyed the health service. They've destroyed it with tax cuts and so forth. So that's a big issue, really. Not just about how we find connection, but how we change the very fabric of our society.
So it's much more much worse than disconnection, actually, and it's
much worse.
Yeah, and it's something, and it's also to do with not only individual narcissism, but I would say collective narcissism. I think it is the collective narcissism that is to blame for most things, not the individualized version, because we like to find this mythical person who's to blame for all of it, rather than taking responsibility, as a group. But going back to the question of how can CFT or any other type of therapy be helpful, or how therapy should be developed or applied in the future. So how do you see the future of CFT and therapy in general, Paul?
Well, I think a lot of the therapies there's a whole group of these therapies all moving in the same direction. I mean, Dan Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology, polyvagal theory, the body keeps the score, Alan Shaw's work about how psychotherapy stimulates the right brain. So there's lots and lots of therapies now that are becoming biopsychosocial. That is the future of psychotherapy, is how can we become biopsychosocial? Absolutely. But your point is very, very important, that as therapists, we must also become politically active, right? So we've got people, I don't know if you know Julian Abel, who's a physician, wrote the book, The Compassion Project, and how he worked with communities to get communities to support themselves, and showed a radical drop in A&E admissions and many things, because loneliness is a big issue, particularly for elderly people, linked to all kinds of mental health and physical health problems. So we need to definitely work with communities and do much more work with a community. How do you use compassion insights? And they're not just from CFT. I mean, Buddhism has been going on about this for thousands of years. How do you use insights about how you build compassionate communities to get out there and build compassionate communities? So that's a very major thing that we're interested in at the moment.
So my last question, I promise, Ada, because I know you have some question you'd like to ask yourself. So do you think, Paul, that therapists can be political and can be neutral? Do you think we should be neutral? No.
You either believe that caring is important or you don't. I mean, the thing is, if you believe that caring, the psychology of caring, is fundamental to well-being, you can't be neutral on that. You can say, well, no, it doesn't really matter. No, it does matter. Yeah. It matters hugely. And therefore, whether it's in politics or within our local community, wherever it is, we have a duty of care, right? So that's why we work with a group called Compassion in Politics. You might have heard them. And they're doing things like trying to get our government to agree not to pass legislation that knowingly harms the disadvantaged. Because when we went through austerity, it was very clear that those measures were going to harm the disadvantaged. Those least able to pay were the ones that were being asked to pay. And the World Health Organization, the United Nations, really criticized the UK government for austerity measures. Now, you can't have governments that do that. You just cannot do that. So that's one of the campaigns that Compassion in Politics are trying to instigate, not to pass laws that knowingly cause harm to the less able to defend themselves. So that's those sorts of things we're very, very keen on. And that's all based on this understanding that caring, the psychology of caring, is fundamental to how our brains and minds are organized. And therefore, those are the values that we have to spread through society. We've got compassion training going on in schools, getting children to understand the importance of caring and sharing, not just competing and being first, right? But actually caring and sharing is a very important value to live your life by. So, yes, we can be political, and we can be very active.
The reason why I'm asking this is because often, for instance, in supervisory groups, there are these therapists would say, I'm not interested in politics. I need to be neutral, and yes, do not mention these type of topics. And I just think, pardon my French, that it's bullshit.
Is it even possible to be like neutral and and be yourself at the same time? It's like impossible.
No, I mean, I think it's a great point you make. It depends upon the kind of therapy you're doing, right? So if you're doing psychodynamic therapy where people are simply doing free association, blah, 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 then yes, of course, you want to be neutral in the blank sheet. But I don't do that therapy. I don't do that therapy. I do a therapy where people come and they have a human relationship with me, and I use my psychological knowledge as best as I can to guide them, to help them think about this or that, to give them things they can practice, to help them understand how the brain is very tricky, and so on and so on. So it depends on the kind of therapy that you're doing. If you want to do neutral therapies, okay, that's okay. But a lot of therapies are not. A lot of therapies are based upon the therapeutic relationship. And in that case, you have to be authentic. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it.
Plus, going back to what we discussed before, we do not live in a void. We are interconnected. We depend on all these other people and factors. But yeah, so we could be discussing it for a very long time. But again, over to you, Adam, because I know that you have some therapeutic.
Yeah, just one point on that neutrality. Suppose I have somebody who's very right wing. I don't have to engage with that at all, right? I can, say those are your political beliefs, but I'm still going to talk to you a little bit about how your brain works, how you be compassionate to yourself. If you learn how to mentalize and empathize and develop positive relationships with other people, that's good for you. That's good for them. I can do all of that stuff. I don't have to talk about the political stuff. I can just talk about the value of developing a caring mind. That's it. And you do what you want with it. You might stay in the same politics, you might not. But so when we talk about neutral, politically neutral, I'm not trying to change people's political opinions. That's up to them. But I am trying to help them understand the value of developing a caring orientation to yourself and to others, and how that can help them and develop the courage for them to face whatever mental health problem they need to face.
That's very important what you're saying, because it's not to do with us vetting for this party or the other. That's not part of the job, but rather based on science, especially in say CFT, so scientifically based approaches that actually having this caring attitude might be helpful to you and, by the way, to others.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think my question, if you don't mind that I ask my question now, because it's, I think, very close to what we are talking about right now, that from my point of view, when we talk about those third waves of CBT, in general, the new psychotherapies, like we see something that some people called the fragmentation of the therapy. Yeah, so like we have a new approaches, but we lose from our side the patient, the human that we are working with. And what I observed, that many of those new therapies, they have some maybe techniques, some maybe also frameworks of CFT, and they use it in terms of their frameworks. Like, for example, in acceptance and commitment therapy, in schema therapy, like there is a lot of compassion, like probably the different types. And my question would be, what's your point of view, Paul, about integration and how you understand this integration CFT to other models of the therapy, and if people doing it, how to do it properly?
Oh, well, those are two quite different questions, but very important. But the point is, you're quite right, fragmentation, because what happens is that, if somebody says, oh, there's this therapy, and then they go off and develop training, and you have this thing. We're a little bit the same. In some ways, it's inevitable, except that we try to suggest to people there are wisdoms in all of the therapies. There's some fantastic stuff in ACT, there's some great stuff in DBT, emotion-focused therapy. The point about it is we shouldn't be forced to choose. We should go on the science. If you're a neurosurgeon, you don't have 12 different schools of neurosurgeon to remove a tumor. There's a science to do it, right? And certainly people improve the science and they get better at it. And we can improve the science of therapy and we can get better and better at it. But we don't actually at the moment have an agreed model of the mind. That's the point. We don't have any agreed model. We haven't agreed that we need therapies for motives. We need therapies for emotions. We need therapies for mentalizing or whatever, or behavior exposure. We haven't agreed about what the basic premises are. So people pick up on one, like cognitive therapy, we're going to look at core beliefs, or emotion-focused therapy, we're going to be looking at emotion, and so on. And so although there are wisdoms in all these things, they're not connected. They're not connected through a science of how the brain actually works. That's the problem. And we have many people coming into psychotherapy that haven't had the privilege of a psychological training. And so they don't know the distinction between a motive and an emotion. The number of times, and you've seen this, Julia, I'm sure, the number of times people confuse compassion with empathy, or compassion with the soothing. That compassion is a motive. Soothing is an emotion regulation system. Empathy is a competency. You can use empathy with any motive. You can, if you want to be vengeful, empathy can be quite useful for you. Yeah. So, these simple distinctions people are struggling with because nobody has taught them that.
Exactly, yes. Including at our universities,
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say,
Yes. So we need somehow, not necessarily a CFT. We don't use a particular CFT model. We use a pretty. I can show you. Look, that's my sort of basic textbook. It's a basic textbook of psychology. Everything in CFT is in the basic textbooks. We haven't made anything up. All that we understand about motives, we've taken from the research on motives. All the things we understand about emotions, we've taken from the science of emotions, right? We haven't made anything up. There you go. Well,
yes, there's a really nice book because it refers to various concepts, and doesn't say this one approach is the one that should tackle it. It's rather describing all these things like epigenetics to us, modest therapists, and why this may be important, and how, as therapists or trainers, we can tackle it. So that's the new approach, rather than just focusing on the one, the one sacred modality. So.
That's right. Absolutely right.
If someone wants to more know about CFT, so we have in Poland mindful compassion. If you are showing the books,
or this is a big thick, so but it's actually it has got everything in it. So you should read it, people.
And this is Julia's new book.
Oh, well done, Julia. Now, what Julia's done is brilliant in taking compassion to Poland.
In Polish would be to love. Mindful, mądrze. It
could be more in a wise way. I mean, even insisting on being on wisdom. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, great. And also, my second question, which is connected with the previous one, would be, what's what's the biggest myths about CFT? What CFT is not that people thinks that it is?
It's a great question. So most people, most definitions, go right back to the Buddhist definitions, they have a sort of algorithm. Now, we call it an algorithm because we use evolutionary language, but what it means is there are two parts to compassion. The first part is that we can be sensitive to, we can notice, we can pay attention, we can be mindful of signals of suffering and need. Because if we don't notice it, or we block out from it or dissociate from it, that doesn't go any further. But then the second one is that having done that, we need to do it wisely so that we don't get overwhelmed and we don't get overfused with other people's suffering. That's the thing. But then what to do about it? So the second thing is working out what to do and what would be helpful. And again, you need things like empathy and so forth to work that out. So there are two key processes of empathy. And both of them are, and they're each regulated by different psychological processes. And they also have different physiologies. Now, the core in what we do is compassion, is courage and wisdom. So if you think of a firefighter risking their lives to save somebody, that's a highly compassionate act, which requires considerable courage and wisdom. But they may not make the best parent or the most empathic friend. So compassion is not bleh. It's really also related to the context. Some people in some contexts are very compassionate, but they're not necessarily in all contexts. So there is a general tendency for people with good heart rate variability to tend to be more compassionate than those without. But we also need to think of compassion in terms of the specifics. So sometimes when you have people who are coming into therapy, they may be good at some aspects of compassion, but not other aspects of compassion. For example, they may misunderstand that compassion also requires assertiveness. Okay, that they may misunderstand that compassion also requires the ability to apologize or to forgive. So, what are the qualities of compassion that this person needs to would help them on their journey through there? So courage and wisdom are very important, and we don't go anywhere near kindness with clients because they find that difficult, because that's more of a feeling state. And as you know, we've done research to show that you don't need courage and wisdom for kindness, but you do for compassion. So what we find with our clients is if you hold them to that, it really helps. And we use an example, as you know, to say, look, what's your, first thing is we usually ask people, what do you understand by compassion? And they say, oh, it's being kind to yourself, being nice to yourself. And then you say, so what don't you like about that? And they say, oh, well, it's a bit weak, isn't it? It's a bit this. So then you say, look, I think you've got a different understanding of compassion. I'd like you to imagine you've got a good friend, right? So you bring to mind a good friend. Can you see them in your mind? Yes. Okay. Now imagine that your friend phones you up and they have to go to hospital for an operation, but they're very frightened and they don't know how they're going to go and they're very distressed. How would you be with them? And clients usually say, oh, I'd be concerned, I'd talk to them. And then you say, so what might you do? And the clients will usually say, oh, well, I'd go with them if that would help them. Well, why would you do that? Well, because if you're frightened and you have somebody that's with you who cares about you, that helps you. And you say, that's right. That's exactly what it is. Sensitivity to suffering with a commitment to do something about it, being there as a support, right? So, yeah, that's it. That's what it is. And that's what your journey here in the therapy will be, finding the courage and wisdom to be able to be with your pain, with your distress. That's an act kind of thing, if you like. But also what is it that helps you step by step?
But
what will help you?
The way you describe it, it's more challenging than these mainstream descriptions, including some of the descriptions by certain therapists and trainers. So compassion is all about soothing yourself and self-love, and I even there's like the school of therapy in Poland, and they advertise compassion as you'll be able to self-soothe and but I think that's lacking this important part of that is actually to do with resilience and not only focusing on yourself, fixating on yourself.
Yes, that's right. And that's such a good point you made, because you do soothe yourself, but why? You soothe yourself so you can take action without being overwhelmed. The soothing is to stop you. So the firefighter soothes themselves. Take a breath before they go into the house. The diver, before he does his Olympic dive, grounds themselves before they, the soothing is not Valium. That's not what it's being used for. It's used to actually get you into position where you can take the actions that you need to take in order to change, be assertive or whatever it is. Sometimes you can use it to just slow down. That can certainly be. And sometimes when you're practicing developing your brain, you do want to ground yourself in your body. You do want to settle your default mode. So that is important. But you're quite right. And this concept of self-love is awful. It's just terrible.
Oh, thank you for saying it, because I think it's actually very aggressive, because I wouldn't like to love certain parts of myself or my partner. I think they're absolutely shite. They are awful, but I can understand them. So that's a bit different, so I can understand the function behind them. So that's different, but I don't particularly find this concept either useful or yes, it is. I think it can be harmful.
No, it does feed into it feeds into what you were saying earlier. This self-narcissism, me, and I'm going to love me.
Yeah. And it was my third question about this. Now, in also many therapies, we have this part about the self-compassion what I also met in my practice, like the people many times they even if they need to work on how to focus on others, how to connect with others, the self-compassion makes them more many times concentrate, focus on themselves again, and they feel like, oh, I need to do more self-compassion because I want to feel better, and that's it. And did you often also meet those kinds of problems, or what's your thoughts about this problem? I think that it could be a problem, a misunderstanding about the, in general, compassion, what it is. That this is not only the self, but mostly the others.
Yes, I mean, certainly in Buddhist position, that's correct. I mean, Christian Neff started it off because she had a really bad time. She was very hard on herself. And so she's very clear that she developed self-compassion as a way of dealing with her own self-criticism and so forth. So compassion to deal with criticism, that's pretty useful. But as you say, there's an awful lot more to compassion training than dealing just with self-criticism. It's important to do that. So that's, we're not knocking that. But the ways in which we do that can often be by developing the courage to do what we need to do. For example, leave a toxic relationship. That can be a self-compassionate thing, right? If I today was diagnosed with cancer, I might not be self-critical, but there might be many things that I need to do now to be compassionate to myself, maybe to let go of some of my work, to spend more time with my family, to open up, to get support for my journey, make sure that I'm taking the right medications or whatever. So there are many things that I might need to do to help me through this crisis in my life. And I'm not self-critical, but I've got to be able to kind of focus on what's likely to be helpful. So that's what we see is, how do you focus? Live to be helpful, not harmful to yourself and others. That's our motive, basically. And but I completely agree that this concept of self-love, and the other thing is, you don't need to love people to be compassionate to them. You know, if you're a doctor, for example, if you're doing surgery, you don't need to like your patients. You'll still try to do the best surgery you can, whether you like them or whether you don't. It's not about liking and loving. It's really about the determination to address suffering. You're going to do the best you can to address suffering, regardless of whether you love or whether you don't. And that's the same for yourself, you know, that you're going to address your pain.
Exactly. So I think John Paul Lederach calls this moral imagination, when you include others, including the people whom you dislike, for instance, or the so-called enemies. That actually seeing this interconnectedness and how we are dependent on one another.
That's right. I mean, there's quite a debate in the Buddhist literature, as you probably know, about this concept of loving kindness, because Alalio says, you know, it's benevolence, really. The benevolent wish, may all beings be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. That's at the root of the Buddhist position. It's a deep wish for suffering to end. And that's the key issue. Love is a different issue.
Yes.
The other thing that's kind of interesting, and I'm sure you're interested in that, is that when the Buddha was talking about love, he was talking about non-duality. Okay, he had an experience of interconnectedness, the self-transcendent experience that some people get. Sometimes they have it with a near-death experience or whatever, which is an experience of complete interconnectedness with all things. That's a very different texture. I mean, I've done an interview with somebody who's had non-dual experiences, because there are individuals who are beginning to have these experiences now that have just been part of a documentary. And she said very clearly, it's a sense of overwhelming love. That's the only word I can use, but it's not like I love you, you love me. It's not that. It's a different experience. Some people get it when they take hallucinogenics as well. This deep interconnectedness that's associated with a great joy, a sense of belonging and being. So it's very complicated.
So Paul, on that note, if you don't, and Adam, if you also don't mind me asking about drugs, why not, finish with drugs, So how about psychedelics? What's your take on that, and how maybe, I'm no expert, I wouldn't even say that I am that interested, but it's a topic that's now currently very, popular, let's say, including in the scientific circles. So do you see it incorporated in CFT in any way? And because I also saw that in this book that you wrote and edited, there's a chapter on that. I haven't read this chapter, to be honest, just yet, but yeah.
Well, it's a great question. We're doing it with big study. We're just finishing a big study in Argentina, looking at changes in fMRI and stuff like that. Yes, we think the psilocybin, the magic mushrooms, are very, very interesting because they do give people an experience of interconnectedness. And when people have that experience of social safeness, a real sense of interconnectedness, they naturally become more compassionate. So our study, we're in the process of writing it up, shows that quite clearly, that there is people become more interested in caring for their environment, caring for others around them when they have these experiences. And there's those individuals who feel separate and alone and having to charge forward and control. Those are the individuals that are doing more harmful things. But so the magic mushroom, psilocybin, is very interesting. And lots of people are looking at that as a way of helping people get experiences of interconnectedness, because that does then change how their mind works.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Do you want to also, for the ending of our interview, Julia, do you want to, on the closing question to Paul, or?
So Paul, if you don't mind, I'm asking a personal question. So why do you do this stuff, compassion, etc., all these podcasts, because working too much, if I may reveal this, well, that's my experience of you. So so why this compassion stuff, Paul?
Oh, it's a great question. So, and I'll have to go shortly to another meeting, but because I'm very angry, because I grew up in a very religious background, right? God is a wonderful creator and everything, and then suddenly you kind of, as you grow up, you suddenly realize, actually, no, hang on a minute, the whole basis of life is predation. All life has to eat other life. We're only here for a short period of time. The way we die can be pretty awful. Humans can be pretty nasty. Viruses are pretty nasty. Bacteria. So how come this loving God created such a shit place, right? Okay, we got some nice things. We can smell the spring air and everything. But basically, underneath life, there's quite a terror. And there's wonderful psychology that you probably know called terror management. So when you look behind the scenes, you realize that all of life is tricky. We talk about tricky brain, and people say, aren't the flowers beautiful? Yes, they're beautiful because they've been competing to attract insects to pollinate them. God didn't make them beautiful. They've evolved to be like that because of competition. So I felt, rightly or wrongly, that I had been deluded. And that actually what really makes a difference is that when we open our eyes to the realities of suffering, which is what Buddhism does, then we can say, okay, we are the individuals who must stand against it. We are the individuals that can, that's why medicine is a fantastic achievement of humanity, and it's because we have put our minds to address suffering, this terrible suffering in the world, the way. Even anesthetics, take anesthetics, they're a wonderful invention that allows you to have surgery and so on and so on. So I feel that because I feel so angry with the fact that people suffer so much with diseases and what's going on in Ukraine and just the horrible things that happen in the world, that we have to stand against that.
Angry compassion.
Angry compassion.
New therapy would be like.
But I personally like it because it's not this wishy-washy romanticized version, but a very real to life version of why this stuff is important.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, if you've had a relative that's died of cancer and been in pain and stuff, you start to think, but humans have been dying like this in their millions and millions and millions and millions, and it's, you know, the way we die. Everybody wants to die with a heart attack in the night and just go to sleep. That's what's
in the bed.
You know, at the moment now, you know, I've got a relative who's dying of dementia. It's just awful, you know. So, but we can do, if we put our minds together and we put the resources, we can do something about it. We can cure these diseases, but we have to fund this, you know, not fund all these weapons.
Or ego boosting stuff.
More working on those kinds of compassion things more than weapons and ways to destroy others.
Yes, that's right. Exactly, Adam. Exactly. How to be helpful, not harmful.
So that be a message from our podcast.
Use.
Okay.
And playful. Find joy in life, even though you can be driven by anger. Actually, the secret is also to find great joy in what you're doing. There is a joyfulness in pursuing compassion.
I tend to say this is very serious and not serious at all. You know, such is life. You know.
Such is life.
My favorite. I love Monty Python and the "Always Look at the Bright Side of Life" melody. It's like. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, it's a great song, that.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very, very much, Paul.
Inviting me in this wonderful discussion and lovely questions, and you're doing wonderful work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam.
Spreading the word.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, and thank you, Julia. Too. Thank you very much, and hope see you sometime.
See you again. Okay.
See you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.